Well, hey there, and happy Thursday. If you're hearing this message, that means you made it. This is the first episode of Dark Reflections. I'm Nick, your host, and for the next 15 or 20 minutes, we're going to recap the last episode. As well, we'll touch on a bit of podcast-specific news that's currently making its rounds in the media and making headlines. Again, this is just something I really wanted to do that's informal and meant to at least give me the opportunity to express my opinions on what we talk about in the main line. So to start this week, I wanted to backpedal a bit so we can talk a bit more about the Dyatlov Pass Incident, what we discussed in Chapter 21. So if you couldn't tell from the recording, I actually had an absolute blast and had fun with doing the recording and all of the Russian voices. The couple people that I've talked to that listen closer to my area have actually said that they really liked the episode. The story of Igor Dyatlov and his group is always one that's really fascinated me, just because it's an unexplained mystery and nobody's ever been able to solve it. The closest that they ever came was stating that it was an avalanche, and that of course was also the state-sponsored idea. Because if you remember in it, the state actually closed the case very quickly and stopped investigating almost as soon as they had enough to go on. To see it in more detail though, we really need to look at a lot of their evidence, as there really wasn't much to go on. Their findings would really start with the tent, which of course had the big gash in it from somebody in the group cutting themselves out. And we knew they were prepared to get out, because if you remember the diary entry from Zenaida Kolmogorova, she actually did mention that the group did have a knife. The piece that I really find that's interesting about it though, is that the group cut themselves out of the tent and ran off into the dead of the night in freezing cold temperatures. Being the experienced hikers that they were, they really knew what would happen if they left that tent. So whatever the group encountered was something enough to scare them out of it. Half dressed and more or less barefoot. The only tough thing though, is that they didn't really have anything to go on when they actually came to investigate. They found sets of footprints leading away from the site to a group of trees where it looked like the first two tried to start a fire. Now the Chief Inspector Lev Ivanov said that almost looked like it was a confirmed source of a heat ray, but who really knows? The avalanche theory had really never set right with me, only because there was no signs of an avalanche and nothing has ever been reported in that area. Even the idea of the Russian Yeti or the Mank can go right out the window. There were no other sets of footprints, at least per the inspector's notes, and no sets of footprints other than the hikers. And something of course as big as a Yeti would certainly leave discernible tracks. So my theory on this as a whole is that it had to be something from the air. Now the theory that it could have been a Soviet testing range does seem to make sense, because there do exist weaponry that are projectile airburst weapons. That would lead something to explode above the tent, not hitting the hikers, and scare them enough off into the dark of the night. In that same vein, it would also account for airborne extraterrestrials. It's entirely possible that the glowing orbs in the sky that were even noticed by a group 50 kilometers away might have also been what scared them out of the only shelter that they really had. Now, the injuries that the cadavers were found with could sometimes really be anything. It could have been injuries that they sustained along the trek, or something that they encountered that night. That being said, if it was extraterrestrials, it's possible that they found them near the brink of death, and that they actually did some cruel experiments on the hikers before returning them to succumb to the elements. Let's look at Ludmilla, for example. She was actually found kneeled over, facing the snow, missing a ton of her face. It almost seems as though she was harvested. But in that breath, why only her? Why not take things from others? Maybe they saw something in Ludmilla that nobody else had. Either way, we'll never really know what happened to the Dyatlov group. My personal conclusion, before we move on, is that it was something airborne. Whether it was projectile, airburst, Soviet weaponry, or extraterrestrials, whatever came for them, came from above. No avalanche, no footprints. Something came for them that was above their heads. Now, in this week's story, we covered the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, a story that, no matter who you are or what walk of life you're from, everybody has heard of this story to some capacity. Often, it gets confused with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln and John Wilkes Booth, something that I've made on occasion myself. The one thing that was really bouncing around in my head the whole time I was researching and recording the episode was that Abraham Lincoln once had a secretary named Kennedy, while Kennedy, as mentioned in the episode, had a secretary named Lincoln. I know, right? A little bit of an aha moment. Anyway, thanks for entertaining me, and like I said, I just had to get that out of my head. So John F. Kennedy went to Dallas in an attempt to smooth over relations with the infighting going on with some of his party members there. Unfortunately, Jack Kennedy would not make it out of Dallas, as of course we know he was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. Into the nitty-gritty of this episode, it was really discovering whether or not Lee Harvey Oswald was part of a bigger plot. I'll immediately preface this by saying absolutely he was, and I really do believe Oswald was made a patsy, as he stated. The one reason why I truly believe that is that Oswald really didn't have the connection to Kennedy to outrightly go out and shoot him. Sure, he might not have been happy with some of the ways that he was handling the Cuban situation, or even might not have been happy with the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. However, I just don't see Oswald going out and plotting an assassination on his own, especially when he had nothing to gain. There might have been an original hope that had he assassinated JFK and Lyndon Johnson took over as president, that might have been the opportunity to attack Cuba. But we know that had they attacked Cuba, it likely would have elicited a response from the Soviet Union. As history played out, no matter how unhappy that the fat cats of Dallas or anyone in the United States was, that Kennedy didn't attack Cuba, they also didn't put any pressure on Johnson either. Which really points to that one part in the episode that I really think, who had the most to gain from Kennedy being out of the way? Of course, the incumbent, by virtue of assassination, Lyndon Baines Johnson. No one would be more connected to the FBI, the CIA, and organized crime than the president. I do believe, like his mistress mentioned, that it was something they had planned for a while. Also, the one clever thing is that the Secret Service actually did reconnoiter the parade route before anything actually happened. They determined that it was the safest possible spot. Mind you, there was the overlook from the triple overpass, the grassy knoll, and of course where the shots were taken, at least by Oswald, the Texas School Book Depository. Not taking that into account, and then at the same time not providing or being prepared enough to protect the president, is also something glaring. Of course, there were many theories that we discussed: New Orleans, organized crime, the CIA, the Secret Service, and many more. As mentioned in the episode, there are a ton of conspiracy theories that surround this event, and should you choose to really look into them, it's like going down a rabbit hole. They go so deep and so far that you sometimes don't even recognize it after you get to the end of it. So I really tried to give you an idea in this episode of just some of the bigger ones. As for my thoughts on the case, I think I've already made them up to this point that I do believe it was Lyndon Baines Johnson that had something to do with the assassination of JFK. We know he had the most to gain. After all, he became president with a 1,000-yard stare Jackie Kennedy next to him taking the oath. We know he hated the Kennedys. We know JFK was going to drop him in the next ballot. Everything there points towards a clear motive for LBJ. Will it ever be proven what or who it actually was? It's possible. After all, we do have 2029 to look forward to, when the majority of the documents that are left are unsealed. After that, we should have everything, and of course it just depends that when they release the documents, if they'll be redacted completely or not. The other piece, just before we move on, that I really can't help get away from is the Warren Commission. It's very clear that they were provided some information, but not all, from the FBI and the CIA. The other interesting piece is that the Warren Commission only used evidence that supported their single-shooter theory. If it's true that Oswald was being set up to be a patsy, then the government would want to do everything that they could to prove that theory. Basically, once Jack Ruby had shot and killed Oswald, that was basically the end of it. That they could wrap everything up with a pretty bow and move on and let everybody forget about it, even though the world never did. Now, there isn't really much in the world of paranormal news this week, so basically our first episode here of Dark Reflections was more or less my theories and recaps on our past 2 episodes. A few points I did want to bring forward is that 1, like I said in my original social media posts, I would be open to a co-host specifically for this segment. It would definitely be nice to get someone else's opinion on the story, at least for a sober second thought. In addition, if you've also got any stories that have happened to you, whether it be the paranormal or some kind of UFO encounter, I'd love to hear them. Feel free to submit them to insidiousagendapodcast@gmail.com. Whether you want to submit text, or if you even want to submit a recording, I can put it right into this episode. Also, if you haven't been following social media, I highly recommend you check out at least our TikTok, Instagram, or Facebook pages. On there, I've dropped the December slate of episodes for things coming up, and I think it looks absolutely amazing. For those of you who haven't seen it, I'll recap it right here pretty quick for you. So of course, we kicked off this month on the 6th with the conspiracy story of the Kennedy assassination. On the 13th, we're going to explore the Romeo and Juliet story of true crime, the tale of Bonnie and Clyde. On the 20th, we have the story of a purported vampire from Eastern Europe. Her name was Elizabeth Bathory, but she had an even better name gifted to her by the public, the Blood Countess. On Christmas Day, yeah, that's right, you heard that correctly. On Christmas Day, I've got a special bonus episode coming your way. It's the next iteration of the folklore appendices about the Christmas devil known as Krampus. There, we'll explore why Krampus is the direct, dark reflection of St. Nicholas, in addition to reading a short story about the legend of Krampus. I don't expect many to tune in on Christmas Day, unless it's after all the present opening and before turkey and things like that. Nonetheless, it'll be there for you for the week in between, whenever you get the chance. And on December 27th, to close out our year, we have the true story that inspired 2003's Open Water, the disappearance, or possibly a better term, the abandonment of Tom and Eileen Lonergan, whose fate was either left to Mother Nature or the mouths of sharks. And that will round out our slate for the year. I really think it's been awesome up to this point. Around New Year's Eve, I'm also planning a State of the Union of sorts for the podcast up to this point. As you know, we really kicked off in June. That's when things really got going with the release of our first episode, all about Annalise and Michelle. It's been 7 months. It's hard to believe it's been 7 months since I started the podcast. I've told so many amazing stories and received some really nice comments through YouTube and through the email box. To those who have supported me throughout this time, I really wanted to say thank you. It's been a bit of a tough year, but the podcast and my listeners have always been there. So thank you for listening. And that's it. This has been our first episode of Dark Reflections. It'll be a little bit more substantial and put together as I go, once I develop a really good flow for how I want to do this. As mentioned in the mainline episode, I'm only expecting them to be around 15 to 20 minutes. If I can attract another co-host, we might be able to go a little bit longer. I know some, and I've received emails in the box asking for my opinion on things. I'm very hesitant to put them in the mainline episode, only because I want to stick to the story, and that my opinions don't need to convolute that story. Ergo, we now have Dark Reflections, when you'll get my ideas and thoughts on the episodes as we go along. I'm intending for Dark Reflections to be released every Thursday to our YouTube and Facebook pages. So if you haven't already, go and hit the subscribe button so you can find your way back again next week. So thank you very much for coming, and this has been another week on the Insidious Agenda Podcast. I'm Nick, and I just wanted to say thank you for listening. I'll see you Tuesday.